Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to this week's edition of the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series. My name is Ann Stout, and I'll be sitting in as your host today. Quick introductions in terms of how the webinar will work. So I'll give a quick introduction here, and then we'll have about a 25-minute presentation. Any questions that you have during the presentation, please submit those in the chat. Submit those to me, and then I'll pose those to our presenters when we get to the end. We'll have ample time for Q&A at that point. So our presenters for today include Matthew Streeter, who's an assistant research scientist with the Iowa Geological Survey, and Keith Schilling, who is the state geologist and director of the Iowa Geological Survey, both out of the University of Iowa. And so we're excited to have Matthew and Keith here to share some of the really fascinating work they've been doing at Lake Red Rock. I know I heard some snippets of this work this past summer at the Soil and Water Conservation Society meeting, and I'm excited to have you both dig in a little bit deeper and share this with our webinar audience today. So without further ado, Matthew and Keith, the floor is all yours.
Hey, thanks, Ann. This will be a tag team presentation, so I will start, and Matthew will do the middle part, and I'll end it. So just to dig in a little deeper, why that's stay there we go. I wanted to mention our funding and partners. So this is definitely work that we've been conceptualizing for a long time, but it doesn't really come to into play until we get somebody to help fund it and pay for it and get suitable partners. So the project was funded by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the Engineering with Nature program. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge Chuck Thiling from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for his support. They're important collaborators in this process, and you'll see and hear several of their names mentioned throughout the study. This was really multifaceted, and we had a lot of people involved. So Tom Eisenhart, Jen Merriman from Iowa State, NREM Department, Antonio Arenas from Civil and Environmental Engineering, Elliot Anderson from the Iowa Geological Survey. Without getting into the background about why nutrients are important, and we all know that, everybody on this call, let's just dig in right to the goal of this project. And the goal of this project was to assess the potential for achieving additional nitrate reductions in Lake Red Rock with manipulating reservoir levels to inundate additional delta sediments. It's kind of a unique project, but it fits really well with the Army Corps and their Engineering with Nature program. More specifically, we had several goals of the project, and we're going to talk about some of these during this presentation. So our first part was to analyze historical conditions in Lake Red Rock to quantify the current nitrate load reductions occurring. And then Matthew will talk about some of the delta sedimentology, and then we'll get into how we measured total nitrogen loss in delta sediments, and then we'll end with how we can use this information to come up with a plan to reduce nitrate concentrations with reservoir stage management. We have a current project going on where we're doing boat surveys at Lake Red Rock, and we'll talk about that at the end too. So the first part of this project was essentially what are the historical nitrate load reductions that we've measured over the life of Lake Red Rock. Lake Red Rock is located southeast of Des Moines on the Des Moines River. It receives drainage from both landform regions in the area, so the Des Moines Lobe, the recently glaciated area, and the Southern Iowa Drift Plain. It's a large watershed draining to that reservoir, so there's a lot of nutrient inputs coming into it. Historically, what's interesting about the Lake Red Rock and other Iowa reservoirs is that there's a great long-term monitoring record associated with its lifetime. So in Lake Red Rock, there's data extending back in time till 1978, which is an amazing long-term data record of water coming in, water going out from the reservoir. There's also a nice set of data associated with the tributary inputs into Lake Red Rock from the north side, could be represented by Walnut Creek watershed and the long-term monitoring going on there. And then the Iowa DNR maintains a long-term record at Whitebreast Creek to essentially capture all the inputs that might be coming into the reservoir from the south. So the goal of this historical water quality analysis, which is essentially to say, what is the current load in, what's the current load out, and then the difference is essentially how much load reductions in nitrate we might expect to see in the reservoir. So from this long-term data, we run a couple load estimation models, and we get an idea of the nitrate essentially budget of Lake Red Rock. The graph on the upper right is essentially saying that the loads are completely dominated by the Des Moines River. The little magenta or color at the base is essentially the loads from the north and the south. So contributing only 3% of the tributary inputs. So it's overwhelmingly the Des Moines River. And if you take a long-term average of this water budget of water coming in, water going out of nitrate loads, you see of our monitoring, we come up with a long-term average of about a 12.4% reduction of nitrate load per year occurring. So water comes in and the water leaving is 12% less in terms of nitrate load. The graph in the lower right says that the work at Lake Red Rock is really consistent with other Midwestern flood control reservoirs in terms of the load reduction we might see relative to how long the water is retained in the reservoir. So you can see where this study fits in at about 12%. This is actually Saylorville, and other watersheds with longer residence times get more nitrate load reduction. But our question, this kind of forms a question that we wanted to investigate with this study would be, can nitrate reductions be increased with stage management? Essentially increasing the residence time, increasing the connection with delta sediments. So from here, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew.
Yeah, so I'm a soil scientist, and I like to use the soil as much as possible because it's the most natural way, I think, to filter our water, to improve our water. And obviously, as a lot of people probably already know, the reason that this works so well is because soils and the sediments, in this case, that they used to be soils that are coming from up, agricultural places in the watershed, they're full of microbial life and they're full of carbon. And all of these microbes that are in the soil and in the sediments, they have to have a carbon source, something to eat, and they also have to have oxygen. They have to be able to breathe, essentially. What happens when these soils and these sediments get inundated or they get saturated, these microbes go anaerobic and they start consuming that nitrate, and they get their oxygen from that location instead of from the atmosphere. And so if we move into the Des Moines River Delta, this area that's 17 or 1,800 hectares that's feeding into Lake Red Rock, you'll find a tremendous amount of carbon-rich sediments. And so the assumption here, the hypothesis is that if we inundate those, if we make them flood more often, that we will get increased nitrate reduction. But we really don't know how much loss we would find because we don't know a whole lot about the sediments in this location. So to give you a little bit of a background about the delta, this is really in an elevation range from about 741.5 to 745 feet. So not a big difference in elevation here. That's the lower delta, and this is the area of that delta, about 800 hectares or so, where you get a lot of inundation annually. This is the most active area of the delta. So that area of the slide there that's wrapped in red. So that's a really active delta range. That's where we wanted to work because it's the most likely place where that inundation can happen, where we can do the manipulation. So what we wanted to do is get out in this Des Moines River Delta and take a bunch of samples and identify what kind of sediments we actually have there. And the reason we needed to go out and take all these samples, you can see 50 or 60 different sampling locations. Go ahead, Keith, to that next one. is because we really have no idea. Now you can see on the left, this is the historic soil map from before Lake Red Rock was formed, and we have a pretty good idea about floodplain soils and everything that's out there. But after Red Rock was formed, and specifically since 1992, when the lake level was raised into this location, we really have no idea about what's going on out here. And soils can form pretty quickly, and I'll show you in a couple pictures here in the next slide or two that I think we've got a lot of soil development going on out here. It's not just about the carbon source that's coming in, it's not just about the sediments that are coming in, but how fast we can actually move sediments through those soils to get nitrate loss. And as soils develop, we get increased structure, we get blocky structure, granular structure, the organic matter increases, and we're allowed to move water through this system. So we wanted to map these sediments to see, first, do they have the potential for nitrate loss, but also, are there certain areas of the delta that might work better than others? So we have a couple of major river channels that are moving through. We also have these kind of more plain environments where there are bays or backwaters where presumably the sediments are quite a bit different. We want to say, are there differences in those locations? Go ahead, Keith, to the next slide. I've got a couple of pictures to give you an idea about what we're looking at in the lower delta. So this is an example of a delta plain in that lower delta. And you can see that we're kind of perched above the main river behind us, but we're still standing in water. You can see Keith standing in the water there in that right picture. Now, it's a little bit hard to tell, but if you can see towards the top end of that picture on the right, the soils that are on that table, they're a brown color. They're a light brown. They're called oxidized. And that's really where that soil development is occurring. And that's where we're going to get the most interaction with water. The hydraulic conductivity is going to be the highest. We've got the most potential. The area below that, the grayer sediments, are a finer sediment. They're a lot higher in silt. Water's going to move a lot more slowly through it, but it's also wetter. The gray is giving us an indication of that wetness. So we wanted to go out and map this and see really where the gray sediments were, where those oxidized upper sediments were. Do we actually have soil development? How fast is water going to move through here? Do we have enough carbon for the bugs to eat? And so forth. So that's why we went out, took a lot of these samples. Go to the next one, Keith. This is an example of our channel locations, and you can see we're working with the DNR out at I'm trying to say his name, Todd Gosselink. He ran a boat for us for a lot of days out at Lake Red Rock, the IDNR, and drove us around and allowed us to jump off their boat in our waders and take a lot of samples. You can see that even in our channel environments from that picture on the right, we still have oxidized sediments that are on top of that really kind of more dense gray subsoil sediments. So the channels were a little less unique than the plains than we expected. And I've got some data to show that on the next slide. And I'm not going to bore you with it for more than just a second here, but I want you to see the differences in a couple of things. Now, notice that first column is the sand percent. And the sand percent in between our channel and our plain was about 12% different. So there's quite a bit more sand content in the distributary channel, which we would have kind of assumed because it's a faster moving water. So we're going to get coarser materials that are dropping out. The finer materials can't drop out. The water's too fast. And that holds really even more so at the very surface. So that's the second set of rows there, is just looking at the surface sediments. You can see that the channels have 42% average sand, whereas the plains are cleared out at 24% average sand. That makes a difference for these hydraulic conductivities. At the same time, if you look over to the right side of that slide, you see the thing that says TC. That's total carbon. We wanted to look at the difference in carbon content in the channels versus the plains to say, is there enough carbon for the microbes to actually do the work, even in a channel environment where we have more sand, presumably less carbon? There is less carbon. There's significantly less carbon in those channels compared to the plains. You can see that it's 0.98% carbon in the channel versus 1.23 in the plain, more or less the same at depth. You can also see at the very right side there, the bulk density a little bit higher in the plains than the distributary channels. That's because of that higher clay content, and sediment's going to move a little bit slower there. Go ahead to the next one, Keith. Now, this is just briefly I won't belabor this at all, but briefly showing you the differences at depth. So you can see at the top of is the soil surface, and 20 is 20 centimeters, or all the way to 122, which is about 4 feet deep. You can see that there's not a lot of change as you move down to 4 feet deep within these sediments. They're mostly uniform, except in that 40 to 60 centimeter range in both the channels and the plains. There's a big difference in sand content, texture. Even our carbon has some differences in that location. It's a pretty good indicator that we've got some major flood events that have happened and deeper in the profile. Excuse me, sorry about that. Go on to the next one, Keith. So why does this all matter in terms of the big picture for the delta? First of all, we wanted to quantify the potential for the nitrate loss, which just getting an idea about the surface sediments can give us a good idea about how much nitrate loss we can expect. But I also wanted to kind of quantify how much sediment is actually sitting here, how much carbon is actually sitting here that we're storing, from the time that this delta was formed, which is just since about 1992. And just real quickly here, in the top 4 feet that we sampled, we have 15 million tons of sediment. That's 186,000 tons of total organic carbon, and it's approximately 8% of the eroded sediment in the watershed since 1992. And that's just the watershed below Saylorville Lake. And in the entire 30-foot deep deposit, we think that the delta is about 30 foot deep, 110 million tons of sediment, over 1 million tons of organic carbon, and that accounts for about 60% of the eroded soil in that watershed since 1992. So this delta is holding a massive amount of the sediment that we're losing from our agricultural lands in this watershed. Go ahead, Keith. Let's skip over that one. I'm not going to labor that. The last thing I want to talk about here real quick, because I'm going slow, are the inundation contours. So we wanted to see, do these sediments work for nitrate loss? But then we also need to quantify if we raise lake levels or lower lake levels, how many more hectares or acres of land will we actually cover? So what we did is we worked with Antonio Arenas at Iowa State University, and he used Sentinel satellite imagery. That gets us daily satellite imagery for the delta. We lined that up to specific lake level days. So we said, Antonio, we need a satellite image on a certain day when the lake level was at 741.5 and no clouds. And so he would find that for us, and then we would have a picture, and we know the level of the lake, and we would literally trace the edge of the lake and the land to give us the idea about how much land we were inundating with different levels. So with that inundation contour, go ahead to the next one, Keith. We can develop a relationship for that area versus elevation. And you can see off of that graph on the right, as elevation increases, so does inundation area, but it's not linear. So at some point, you're getting, a nice benefit. And you can see that when you get clear up to about 740, 8 feet or so, all of a sudden you've inundated everything and you get no further benefit. So I'm going to turn it back over to Keith now, and he can finish up for a few minutes and talk about why all that matters for the nitrate loss.
Yeah, so Matthew described essentially the physical container and the inundation of these sediments. That gets us the area, that gets us the material. We still need a number to apply for potential nitrate loss. So this is where help from Iowa State University and Tom Eisenhart and Jen Merriman, who's pictured here, who did all the work, helped us to quantify the rate of nitrate loss in these sediments. So Jen went out and took small cores at all of our locations where we had done the sampling that we did for the physical stuff, grabbed shallow cores, went back to the lab and did some testing in the lab to measure essentially what's the rate at which total nitrogen, it's nitrate, how the rate at which nitrate is lost with time in these sediments. Now, we're not quantifying the process involved. We're not quantifying, is it denitrification or is other process going on? This is just nitrate, how does it decay with time in these sediments? And it turns out, despite the variations that Matthew's talking about, and probably the the generality of this procedure, we came up with rather uniform nitrate loss rates. So in terms of grams of nitrate per square meter per day over a 24-hour period, means and medians were very similar at about 0.66, 0.67 grams, again, of nitrate per square meter per day. Small little range, normal distribution. So we felt really comfortable that we could use this average nitrate loss rate and apply it over the entire lower delta. Now, one of the things that we've looked at here is, and with help from Elliot Anderson, who is works for the Iowa Geological Survey, is we could essentially recreate historical stage fluctuations and get a daily stage rate for the entire 29-year period. We're looking from 1991 to 2021 or 2020. And so what this graph on the left shows is essentially like if we increased the stage to a meter, we kept the same fluctuations of highs and lows relative to events coming in and so forth, but essentially raise the base pool stage by a meter in this example. Now, if you take that base pool stage increase and the area of inundation that Matthew's talking about, and the end loss rate measured by Jen, we can come up with how much extra end loss would we expect to see if we raise the stage to certain levels. And that's what's shown here on the right. Over a 29-year period, you can see the dashed line is saying this is our historical end loss there. If we increase the stage by a half a meter, we gain so much additional end loss, potential end loss. 1 meter, you see it kind of increases a little bit with increase in stage because we're inundating more land. You inundate more land with that nitrate loss rate, you're going to have more total nitrogen reduction. That's all summarized in this table. And so I'm going to walk you through a couple things here and to highlight some of the other features. So the stage increase just says how much more of that increase would we hypothetically apply to Lake Red Rock, up to 2 meters. This is how the second column here is the end loss in terms of metric tons over 29 years. Kind of hard to put your arms around what a 29-year loss rate would be. So we annualize that in the third column. Extra metric tons per year that would be lost if we raise the stage at that increment. How much extra end loss is associated with that stage increase, and then we annualize that. Probably the most interesting thing is the last column here, is that assuming some standardized rates of end loss per different conservation practices, and I have the assumptions there in the bottom. Say we have a 20 kilogram per hectare end loss in a field, so many acres of field, and this 50% loss rate gets you about 160 kilograms per year. That's consistent with bioreactors and saturated buffers and even multi-purpose oxbows. So if we raise the stage and that, by these different increases, we have the equivalent of 13 to over 2,300 additional practices that we could put on the landscape that would be equivalent to just manipulating the stage in Lake Red Rock could accomplish. Now the rate of this percent total end loss doesn't increase very much, but this is a large area. So tweaking it a little bit over and then receiving input loads from a large area means we have a lot of mass reduction. So the moral of this story is that there is some benefit to maybe thinking about how to use these large areas that capture large nitrate loads, doing a little bit on that, and we have the equivalent. Like we increase the stage by half a meter, we have the equivalent of almost 640 edge of field practices. That's a pretty big increase in potential practice deployment. Just one more summary here. all the mapping that Matthews describes when completed. We've published soon would be 3 papers on this project. There was the one that describes historical. Matthew has a lead on one that's coming out soon on the sediment delta. And this paper in Journal of Environmental Quality has just come out. In fact, we even made the cover of the journal with one of the photos that you saw. And I can send that to anybody and make that available. It's all open access. We are in the process of continuing our boat survey. So we put a nitrate sensor on a boat, and we collectively, mostly Tom Stepler and other folks, drive the delta environment in a lot of areas and see the main channel, see the cove, see the little side channels, and we see how nitrate concentration patterns may fluctuate and change throughout the delta environment. Another interesting innovation, we'll report on that another day when all that work is done. So that's the end of our presentation. I see that there was a couple questions we can certainly answer, and then I'll turn it over back to Ann.
Yeah, it sounds good. So we do have a number of questions that have come in, and folks, you're welcome to continue submitting those. That's great while we go through a few of these housekeeping items here. So first of all, if you watched today's webinar for a continuing education unit for a CEU, please send an email today by 5 p.m. to Alena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and then your CCA number. And I'll put that in the chat here in just a minute. So we'll then verify that you were indeed here, and we'll get that submitted for you. So Alena Whitaker by 5 p.m. today. And if you are watching today's webinar live, we'd also ask you to please, if you'd be willing to complete this demographic survey, voluntary demographic survey. You've got a couple options to find that. One is at iowalearningfarms.org/survey. Or if you're savvy with QR codes, scan that code on the screen and that'll take you right to the survey there. This is part of USDA funded programming, and so we ask for your participation in the survey. But it's collected, we're asking for your participation just once for 2024. So if you've done this before for a webinar, you're good to go. If you haven't, we'd invite you to do that and you'd be willing to participate. So iowalearningfarms.org/survey. And then our next webinar coming up next week, Wednesday, May 22nd, same time, same place. We'll have Abigail Schulte, who will be diving into solid state anaerobic digestion of prairie biomass and beef manure. So that should be a fascinating talk as well. And then I think we've got one more housekeeping slide of just where you can find the recordings of today's webinar, as well as all past presentations. So you will find those on our website, iowalearningfarms.org/webinars. And then we also have a new YouTube channel specifically dedicated to our webinars and to the webinar recordings. So you can sort by year. You can also dive in and sort by topic where it's organized by playlist. So if you're looking for certain themes, that's a great place to go as well. Same content on both, but you can choose your preferred avenue there for exploring the webinars. Okay, so with that, we have had quite a few questions come in. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So Matthew and Keith, this was earlier on in the presentation. It was about like the mid-teens in terms of your slide numbers, but can you provide more context for interpreting the erosion values that you reported and how you calculated them?
So if we're talking about those big numbers of how much soil or sediments and carbon we're actually storing, so these are a bit back of the envelope in a way. I mean, you just look at statewide Russell estimates and you can get an idea about the area and the depth of the sediments in Red Rock to give that assumption. Now, obviously, we're not accounting for things like bed erosion, bank erosion from the rivers, and so this is likely a bit exaggerated, but I still think that it provides a pretty good idea that we're holding a lot of sediments and a lot of carbon from the upland areas. So this isn't a super sciencey slide, but certainly helps to put it into perspective about what we're actually dealing with here in the Red Rock Delta.
Okay. Are drainage districts currently involved in supporting your monitoring efforts? And if yes, how? And if no, what role do you think they would be best positioned to play?
They were not involved in any aspects of this study. Um, and probably it's hard to see certainly welcome all the partners we can. The fact that it's at one of our three major flood control reservoirs kind of necessitates kind of like uh, our our unit, which is the reservoir scale. And so drainage districts we could certainly learn some lessons from this, though. I'm going to say is that wherever we are collecting and trapping sediment and there's intersections with water levels, we have the potential to implement aspects of this throughout beyond just a simple reservoir. So drainage districts are certainly welcome to contribute. We can certainly think about the sediment and nitrate losses from those systems that would enter into Lake Red Rock, and maybe even a way to kind of share some of the benefits at some level, but they have not been involved in this study.
Okay. Several different questions related to the N losses. So how did your N loss rate vary with temperature or season? And then could you explain how those N loss measurements varied or what influenced those estimates?
Yeah, I didn't throw a graph on there. It's in the paper. We do see N-loss, not just from the laboratory measurements, but we did see N-loss change by season within Lake Red Rock. So you would see much greater N-loss occurring in the warmer months. So it was accounted for in our daily and summarized over annual scale. There's another graph in the paper that shows the seasonal aspects. So it's clearly important, and it's important in terms of the load coming in, the residence time, how warm is it, how much processing is going on, and then what leaves. So all of that was kind of like glossed over to get to this annual scale. But we have all the monthly seasonal stuff in the paper.
Okay, and Keith, you just mentioned residence time. We did have a question. How much of the reduction is due to increased retention time?
Yeah, a lot of it. So the 12% reduction we're seeing related very well to historical or comparisons to other flood control reservoirs. You lengthen the time, you're going to get more reduction. So that's kind of like the default measure. We're saying that we could, if we just increase the volume and the connection of that water with the sediments, we get even more. So part of the inundation is going to be we lengthen the residence time because we're not allowing that water to drain very fast. So in a way, it's kind of all related. But our focus here was simply just the stage and nitrate loss measurements.
Okay, and does the duration of stage increases have a significant impact on N loss?
Yes. In terms of quantifying it, we're probably not at that level. This is, everything's preliminary, but like we're showing an idea here, and so there's going to be more details, more nuance to be fleshed out on this. But yeah, it's the duration is captured a little bit with the N-loss measurements in terms of grams of nitrate per square meter per day over 24 hours. Like we have some level of duration, but duration is going to be impacted by residence time and how much water came in and how much water can be held. I think the next step in this whole process is to really take it to an active level and say, test this out, because it's all kind of theoretical at this point.
All right. How does this approach affect legacy nitrogen versus annual inputs?
I don't think the nitrogen here knows of its legacy or current. It's what's in. I mean, Matthew can describe. He had data on the total in the sediments. I'll let you weigh in, Matthew. I've been talking too much.
No, you're fine. I mean, nitrogen's nitrogen, and it's moving around. Obviously, it's moving through the system, and the stuff that's sitting deep in the soil, a lot of that is like a total nitrogen. A lot of that's organic that's actually being stored there. So it's not necessarily the organic nitrogen that's being stored in the soil, that total nitrogen amount that I think we're dealing with here. It's the nitrate that's actually dissolved that's coming in. And I really don't know about legacy nitrogen in the lake. Probably not a good question for me either, frankly, but I don't think that we're dealing specifically with nitrogen storage in the sediments, and reducing that nitrogen.
Yeah, I will also add to that that the nitrate that's coming in was current nitrate loss from the Des Moines and Raccoon River watershed. So it is all like, we could talk about the legacy of that nitrate coming into the reservoir, but it's all active nitrate in the rivers that's discharging in here. And there's a difference between, the nitrate that's flowing through the basin and the river system versus the organic nitrogen stored in the sediments. So yeah, there's a legacy of that storage, but all the nitrate flowing in is currently what's on the move in our rivers right now.
Okay, sounds good. So the idea, the kind of the premise of the research that you all have done here is that by increasing water levels by not a whole lot, by inundating, it has the ability to potentially result in some sizable nitrogen reductions, nitrogen loss reductions. So the big question is Army Corps willing to do this?
Well, there's interest. It's actually gotten a pretty good reception from Perry at Lake Red Rock for implementation. We can't quite get over the hump in terms of like the funding needed to really take to this next level yet. But there is interest in trying this out. I will have to, I should put a caveat on all this is that, these are flood control reservoirs and their primary purpose is flood control. So there's that. Their second main purpose is recreation. And so, and then a third and important purpose is habitat for wildlife, migratory birds. They have a very prescriptive lake management plan in terms of where they can keep the levels. So we're probably on a stage where we're not going to be given 2 meters of stage fluctuations to play with anytime we want. It's going to be within this reservoir management plan to see where could we tweak it just a little bit to gain additional in loss. So the plan will never be let's like inundate everything and see how much nitrate loss we get, because that minimizes the primary purpose. So as we think about how to implement it, it's definitely within the overall management plan of the reservoir.
Sounds good. And this next question, I think, ties in a little bit related to that in terms of the flood storage, the flood control purposes. So if lake levels are raised, deposition will occur over the area, thereby increasing elevation of the functional nitrate reduction area. So wouldn't the amount of functional increase be finite due to offsetting that reduction then in flood storage?
So I think that when Keith was talking about the flooding versus, later in the year when the shorebirds are around, when the lake levels are lower, that's the key here. Most of this sediment is moving around. We have, these huge influxes of sediment. When we have high rain events, we have lots of precip, the rivers are up. That's when sediment's flowing into these places. Look at the Des Moines River right now. It's a muddy mess. We're getting sediment. We're building the delta right now. And it's, that as that increases, that's when we're building that delta. That's going to happen regardless. Now, when things slow down, we move into those summer months, and now we're talking about raising the lake level just a very modest amount, maybe a half a foot or something like that. When the currents aren't quite as big, when we're not in flood stage, we're dealing with a lot less sediments anyways. And as that sediment does infill into Lake Red Rock, that lower delta is going to continue to build out into the lake. right? So as we continue to build, sure, the delta is going to get bigger, but also that interface where we're dealing with is going to continue to grow. It's always going to be there, so to speak. We have an interface now. We had an interface 20 years ago. It's just in a different location. So that interface between the water and the land is just going to keep moving further down into the lake. But presumably, it's still going to be there, and it's probably going to be about the same size. If anything, it might get a little bigger as that lakeshore widens out.
Sounds good. All right. Do you see these results as justifying a potential retrofit of drainage tile outlet pipes to address nitrate, or where does that come into play with existing drainage systems and like edge of field practices?
Yeah, that would be maybe quite a leap to take this and extend it back to edge of field and drainage systems. If nothing else, I think one of the things this work highlights is the important relationship between these organic rich sediments, inundation, residence time, and things like that. So some of the lessons that we learned on this big scale could apply to like a crepe wetland, or it could apply to a farm pond, anything where you see this active interface between sediment deposition of organic rich eroded soils and high nitrate water. And so I think the big picture lessons need to be kind of like reduced down to the scale of a drainage pipe, more so than how does this impact what's being done up in the field. I would say, though, it's a huge integrator of everything, and so we're talking huge watersheds draining in here with a lot of sources contributing to it. So there is a joint benefit that a reservoir would have as opposed to an individual doing things on their own land or whatever. That this is a shared resource by all the sources coming into Lake Red Rock.
All right, we've got a comment here. Great presentation and awesome study. So kudos, passing that along. And for those of you that are in the audience, any further questions, go ahead and get those typed in now. And with that, that's all that we have right now, but I'll give folks a little bit of time to submit any further questions they have. Keith and Matthew, wanted to thank you for the excellent presentation today. Much appreciated. We really are grateful for your time. Any final concluding thoughts, take-home messages that you'd like to leave us all with?
I'm hoping that this work continues. I would say also stay tuned maybe this fall or early next year, and we got another presentation along from reservoirs that Elliot Anderson can make. We've been looking at these long-term records of nutrient inputs and outputs from reservoirs, and essentially Elliot's done nutrient budgets for our reservoirs, and it shows very interesting similarities and differences between nitrogen, phosphorus, total sediment, and how much these reservoirs are impacting Iowa's waterways. So stay tuned for that. That will be coming. And with any luck, we get additional funding from the Corps or whoever to try and implement and put into practice some of this work.
Yeah, we are by no means done in our reservoirs. I don't think we're really just getting started. This is such an exciting place to work, and in terms of the sediment and the soils, we have a lot of stuff going on out there still. We have been taking deep sediment cores out there, and we're working on developing possibly even some new soil series and mapping that delta. So I showed in that presentation that picture of the current soil map, which is just pink. It's all just water. We're going to try to map that, and there's lots and lots of work to do out there. It's an exciting place. And furthermore, if you're a person who likes recreation and you haven't hung out in the Red Rock Delta, get a boat and go hang out there, because it is a fun place to go and play. It's really great.
Excellent. Sounds good. Well, it sounds like we need to have you two back and others that you're collaborating with as well in the months ahead. So we would love to have you rejoin the webinar series when you've got more results to share. That would be wonderful. Thank you everyone for your time today. Appreciate you tuning into the webinar, and have a great rest of your day.
All right.